Welcome to the series, Yankee Air Pirates, Naval Aviation in Vietnam. I'm Tom Carroll, and I'll be your host. Although the Vietnam War ended when I was in junior high, I felt a connection to it. As a high schooler, I worked on a construction crew, and my foreman, Gary, was a Vietnam veteran, a Marine. Although we talked about many things, we didn't talk much about Vietnam. But when the weather got hot, and we took off our shirts, his bodily combat wounds were clearly visible by his scars. They told me a story that he could not. Years later, when I joined my first squadron on an aircraft carrier, there were still Vietnam veterans in the ready room, on the flight line, and in leadership. Many of them proudly wore Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club patches on their flight jacket, and some of them carried the scars of their service on their bodies. Now, long after U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, it's clear that the stories of the veterans can still inspire us. In the episodes ahead, we'll take a look at the events of the war, the aircraft, and the men involved. An important question we'll return to is, how did these men stay in the fight in the face of adversity? Hope you find the first episode meaningful. The next episode will follow soon. Subscribe if you like it, and let me hear your stories. The Vietnam War was waged in 1,000 places, on the ways of the Gulf of Tonkin, in the Mekong Delta, along and over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, at Khe Sanh, in the urban confines of Hue, over the skies of Hanoi and Haiphong, in isolated cells of the Hanoi Hilton, along the boulevards of U.S. cities, at Washington Tuesday luncheons, in the dark cockpits of aircraft ready to catapult into the black void of night, and in the hearts of the men in the fight. For 8 years, the men flying from U.S. ships fought a determined foe in an unpopular war halfway around the world. They received their tasking, planned, briefed, manned their aircraft, and launched from their floating airfields at sea. They fought their way into the target against SAMs, MiGs, and AAA to deliver the hardest punch they could, or that they were allowed to deliver by the politicians in Washington, D.C. When friends went down, they demonstrated courageous resolve to assist them. Then they fought and evaded their way back to the sanctuary of the Gulf of Tonkin. They nursed their damaged aircraft, and sometimes broken bodies, to get back to their ship. Low on gas, they calculated if they would make it, while tankers strained against time and distance to provide support. Then, finding their ship, and with their bodies stressed beyond what they experienced when dodging SAMs and AAA, they skillfully maneuvered their aircraft to land on the small pitching landing strip. Even when not flying, they faced the constant threat of a major fire on their floating cities, filled with gas and explosives. They experienced moments of great joy when successful in their missions, in times of anguish in the face of loss. Then they compartmentalized their emotions and concerns and did it all again, sometimes 2 or 3 times in a 24-hour period, and they continued this pace for weeks on end. It was not just the MiGs, AAA, and SAMs that were hazardous. The mere act of flying off of a ship was perilous. The following are excerpts from summaries of fatal mishaps during the Vietnam War. Launch cable failed. Pilot unable to eject. One afterburner went out during launch. Ejection attempted. Mid-air collision with wingman at end of BARCAP mission. Controlled flight into terrain during night and in bad weather. Aircraft did not respond to radio calls and flew beyond radar coverage, presumed lost at sea, cause unknown. Landing aircraft hit ramp and disintegrated. The aviators, naval flight officers, and aircrew, the men who flew and fought, did not do this on their own. They were supported by other sailors and Marines, many of which worked 18 or more hours a day, and often in hazardous conditions. Thousands of men, mostly young, worked on the flight deck, directing aircraft, operating catapults and arresting gear, fueling aircraft, loading them with ordnance, and maintaining them. Below decks, teams built up and prepared the ordnance. On the bridge, crews navigated and maneuvered the ship. They conducted one of the most hazardous operations at sea, replenishment of supplies while underway. Far below the waterline and working in stifling heat and in confined spaces, they operated the engineering plants that provided propulsion, electricity, and fresh water. Operators stood constant watch, monitoring radars, radios, and intelligence networks. They fixed everything, from complex electronics to steelwork, and what they could not fix, they manufactured. Medical and dental specialists kept the crew in the fight. Chaplains saw to the crew's spiritual needs. Cooks kept them fed, providing nearly 17,000 meals per day around the clock. And a day before internet and emails, and with no ability to call home from the ship, crews sorted and delivered the letters that meant so much. If one does a simple image search on Vietnam War, one will not find sea-based aviation until sometime well past the 100th image. It's almost like naval aviation wasn't there. But in fact, it was. Navy and Marine flyers operated from carriers as varied as the Ticonderoga that served in World War II to the Enterprise, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier commissioned in 1961. Helicopter crews not only worked from the decks of the carriers, but also flew off of cruisers and destroyers, such as the Chicago and the Jewett. They went to war, at least initially, with aircraft and tactics built for a different kind of war, a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. Yet, as all good sailors and Marines before and since, they used the tools they had and improved them as they went. The aircraft models and aircraft carriers they flew from are all retired from the active inventory now. They have passed into the realm of legend. The piston-powered, propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raider, also called the SPAD, had already been in service for nearly 20 years when it participated in the early strikes against North Vietnam. It could carry a heavy bomb load and was able to loiter on station much longer than its jet counterparts. But as the air defense environment in the North became more lethal, the SPAD's slow speed required it be retired for uses in other venues. The A-4 Skyhawk, called Heineman's Hot Rod after its designer, was a rugged and easy-to-maintain aircraft. Fielded 8 years prior to the Vietnam War, it was designed to carry nuclear weapons, but it was the conventional attack workhorse in the early years of the war, flying more combat missions over North Vietnam than any other aircraft in that time period. The A-3 Sky Warrior, commonly known as the Whale for its size, was designed as a carrier-based strategic bomber, joining operational units in 1956. Although used in the Vietnam War as a bomber in early stages, and while some later aircraft were involved in electronic warfare, the real forte of the A-3D was to provide in-flight refueling to other aircraft. Being that it was not equipped with ejection seats, rather relying on the crews to get themselves out of the aircraft in an emergency, the crews darkly said that the A-3D designation stood for all 3 dead. The F-8 Crusader, a single-engine supersonic fighter, was known as the last of the gunfighters, being equipped with 4 20mm cannon and Sidewinder missiles. It was introduced into fleet service in 1957. Prior to the Vietnam War, when other aircraft communities no longer considered dogfighting an essential skill, the Crusader community did, and it served them well in facing the North Vietnamese MiGs. The Crusaders not only served as fighters, but were often the flak suppressor aircraft of choice. A related model, the RF-8 Photo Crusader, flew hazardous tactical photo reconnaissance missions. Not being armed with cannon or missiles, it was said that the tactical reconnaissance crews flew alone, unarmed, and unafraid. The RA-5 Vigilante looked like speed personified. The original aircraft had been designed as a strategic long-range bomber, but that mission largely went away upon the introduction of the Polaris missile. The RA-5 stepped into the carrier-based reconnaissance role and its crews paid a heavy toll for that hazardous mission. The iconic F-4 Phantom, crewed by a pilot and a radar intercept officer, was designed as a fleet air defense fighter. Fielded a few years prior to the Vietnam War, it did not have a gun. It was not designed for dogfighting. Rather, its design and the crew's training were for long-range missile kills against bombers that threatened the fleet. War being a come-as-you-are affair, the pilots in Rios developed an impressive array of tactics to take on the MiGs in turning fights, and also became key players in the air-to-ground attack role. The A-6 Intruder was a purpose-built, medium-attack, all-weather aircraft that made its first deployment in 1965. Although there were many kinks to work out in its first deployments, it proved to be an extraordinary strike platform. With its pilot and bombardier navigator sitting side by side, it was able to penetrate the most lethal air defenses at night and in the worst weather, while flying nap of the earth to avoid early detection. Its bomb load was so heavy that following a strike by two intruders on a North Vietnamese power plant, Radio Hanoi accused the U.S. of the early introduction of B-52s into the conflict. The A-7 Corsair was designed as a single-engine, light-attack aircraft to replace the A-4 Skyhawk. The design concept was to build a state-of-the-art visual delivery attack platform. In what may seem like a fairy tale to those developing new aircraft today, the A-7's first flight was in September 1965, was delivered to the fleet in October 1966, and was introduced into combat in 1967. Its design team used proven aircraft technology for much of their design, but put their best developmental effort into the aircraft's weapons delivery and navigation systems. The E-1 Willie Fudd and its replacement, the E-2 Hawkeye, provided radar early warning, fighter direction, and command and control. Their long-range radar and other sensors, perched miles above the ships, allowed them to see over the horizon and provide critical warning of threats approaching Task Force 77. When things went south and the crews had to eject or otherwise depart their aircraft, the sound they most wanted to hear was the beating blades of a rescue helicopter. Sea Sprites and the newer and larger Sea Kings flew off aircraft carriers as well as the destroyers and cruisers stationed close to the North Vietnamese coast. The crews of these helicopters displayed selfless courage in their nearly reckless drive to save downed airmen. For the general public, the least glamorous of all aircraft were the C-1 Traitors and their replacement, the C-2 Greyhounds. Yet, it was these aircraft that provided the vital airborne logistics link with bases ashore. Although not glamorous, for the crews of the aircraft carriers, these aircraft were their favorite, for they brought the mail to the ship. The crews of these and other aircraft, supported by those on the ships, carried out the nation's tasking under the most difficult of circumstances. From the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 until the frantic exodus from Saigon in 1975, the impact of sea-based forces, and in particular those of naval aviation, was compelling. This is their story. Vietnam is a country of scenic beauty, yet steeped in conflict. Although in the early 1960s it was a place of little industry or modern capabilities, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong it supported received immense assistance in material, training, and even personnel from the Soviet Union and China. While North Vietnam was helped by other communist powers, the grit and determination to succeed in their goal to dominate South Vietnam was all their own. With limited exceptions, the North Vietnamese military never fielded the most modern ground weapons, but the same could not be said regarding their air defenses in North Vietnam. It was the first war in which SAMs were used, and by the end of the war, North Vietnam had the most advanced air defense system in the world. President Johnson inherited America's limited involvement in Vietnam from President Kennedy, but it was Johnson, with the Secretary of Defense, Robert Strange McNamara, that led the U.S. into deep involvement. In the end, it seemed the Johnson administration was led by individuals who did not understand war, who sought goals which were unattainable by means which were inadvisable. Johnson and McNamara would write the book, on ill-conceived micromanagement, with Johnson once bragging that the military could not bomb an outhouse without his permission. Despite uncertain political leadership, growing protest and controversy at home, and at times even their own doubts, the men launching from aircraft carriers and other ships would in many cases show the finest qualities of courage, endurance, and loyalty to country and to one another. Some of these men were well known in their time, but America's memory of them is fading. Others were never widely known, but their deeds are no less captivating. The Air Wing commander, attack pilot, and student of Stoic philosophy, who was shot down and held prisoner for over 7 years. His heroic leadership, despite injury, prolonged torture, and forced isolation, earned him the Medal of Honor. A junior aviator who kept a private diary in which he recorded his intimate thoughts on combat, war, fear, doubts, and the desire to prevail. Following his death in combat, the diary was found and published, giving unparalleled insight into the heart of the warrior. The lieutenant junior grade helicopter pilot and crew that rescued a Phantom pilot in Rio at night, having sustained multiple hits from enemy fire, lost pieces of the aircraft, hit a tree, and running low on fuel, the helicopter crew made one last attempt, this time with the lights turned on so the downed Phantom flyers could find them, even though the lights highlighted the helicopter as a target. The helicopter pilot was awarded the Medal of Honor. The sailor knocked overboard from a destroyer executing a nighttime gunfire support mission. When recovered by the North Vietnamese, they thought he might be a Navy SEAL, but soon discovered he was just what he claimed to be, a junior sailor in a bad circumstance. Later, when the North Vietnamese offered him an early release, which would have been contrary to the U.S. Code of Conduct, the senior-ranking U.S. prisoner ordered him to take it. Upon his release, the sailor was able to provide numerous memorized details and an accounting of U.S. prisoners, mostly aircrew, which the North Vietnamese had not reported. An aviator and an eventual carrier commanding officer who saw it all, from the Gulf of Tonkin incident to the return of the prisoners of war. Having a friend shot down in the initial retaliatory strikes and feeling a deep need to do all he could to hasten his friend's release, he would make repeated deployments into combat and finally had the joy of greeting his friend mere hours after his release from captivity. The Skyhawk pilot shot down over North Vietnam and severely injured. Being the son of the admiral commanding all U.S. forces in the Pacific region, the North Vietnamese offered him the special favor of an early release, which he refused. After the war, he would become a power to be reckoned with in the U.S. Senate. The tactical reconnaissance pilot and aircraft carrier executive officer credited with quelling a riot on board USS Kitty Hawk when racial tensions had boiled over, with 60 sailors injured in attacks and fights. As stated by one authority, in the mold of a reconnaissance pilot, he went in alone, unarmed, and unafraid, and confronted the hostile group of armed sailors. Through sheer force of personality, he convinced them to surrender their makeshift weapons and end the riot. The fighter pilot, who along with his radar intercept officer, would shoot down 5 MiGs and become the first aces of the war. The fighter pilot would later become a U.S. congressman, but would leave that role under a dark cloud. The naval aviator, shot down and held as a prisoner of war, was credited with being the first to let the world know of the secret torture prisoners were undergoing by blinking the word torture in Morse code while being interviewed by a foreign reporter. And at the end of the war, in his release as a POW, he rose to the rank of admiral, and upon retirement went into politics. The squadron commanding officer who, while flying his A-4 Skyhawk, was hit with AAA. Feeling a pain in his right arm, he looked down and saw his severed arm laying on the console. Instructing his wingman, who was on his first combat mission, on what to do as they evaded flak, he used his remaining hand to maneuver his own aircraft as he bled profusely. He remained conscious long enough to make it near a destroyer before he ejected. He would survive and was successful in his fight to stay on active duty. The lieutenant commander attack pilot, who displayed exceptional aggressiveness and nerves of steel in duels with surface-to-air missile batteries. After multiple successful Iron Hand missions, His luck ran out when he was hit and killed by a SAM. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. The Carrier Air Wing commander, a A-6 pilot and sometimes poet, who led one of the most important strikes of the war, the mission to mine Haiphong Harbor. Knowing he planned to fly in low, he was asked if he agreed with the plan that the covering destroyers and cruisers would assume any aircraft above 1,000 feet would be hostile and shot down. CAG responded, "No, I want everything above 500 feet to be declared hostile. We'll be well below that." The mission was a success. Operating as part of Task Force 77, the aircraft carriers and their escorts operated from Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin, 100 miles off the North Vietnamese coast. The waters and sky above the Gulf were a sanctuary that the Navy ruled. If a pilot in distress made it to the Gulf, his chance for living were greatly improved. The crews proudly referred to their collective force as the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club. The men who flew from the carriers and other ships were virtually all volunteers, unlike some of those fighting ashore. And unlike those fighting ashore, if any of the pilots or naval flight officers should decide they could not take it anymore, if their nerve broke, they could turn in their wings and they could be gone from the war zone in days. Remarkably, that was a rare occurrence. Their drive to fulfill their duty and their desire to maintain the respect of their fellow naval aviators and themselves gave them remarkable staying power. At the tactical level, these aviators were led by Carrier Air Wing commanders, squadron commanding officers, and executive officers. These leaders did not merely send their men in harm's way, they led them there, from the front, flying the same dangerous missions as their men. In this compelling demonstration of leadership, a heavy price was paid. A reported 67 CAGs, COs, and XOs lost their lives during the Vietnam War. In the course of the Vietnam War, numerous naval aviators, naval flight officers, and aircrew lost their lives, were captured, and sometimes just disappeared. Decades after the end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the Navy alone lists 352 personnel, the vast majority flyers, as unaccounted for, whereas the Marines list 202 personnel, again, the majority flyers. For those shot down over enemy territory and captured, they were to undergo an unspeakably challenging ordeal. Tortured for military information and propaganda, most resisted to their utmost, which for some was to death. For those who survived to be released from captivity, many would carry torture-induced scars on their bodies that testified to their courage. Throughout the war, those in naval aviation executed their tasking with consummate skill and at great sacrifice. Even during times when political leadership failed to provide a reasonable strategy, and even when U.S. public support was tenuous at best, the aviators, naval flight officers, and aircrew found support in one another, whether on Yankee Station, in the cockpit, or in the prison cell. It is their stories that this series will explore.